Great.
So let's just get into it because running a bit late. Okay. So yeah, so I was when you kind of very interesting but unusual approach asked me to talk to you. I guess I was interested in the sense that I do feel it's a totally different landscape every way, politically, culturally, socially, and environmentally today, obviously, than it was 75 years ago when the Snowy launched. But I think it could be instructive just to see what we can take from it. So this is a picture, even the very picture on the cover of my book of these guys doing the transmission lines without safety harnesses, it's another world. And these fellows here were mostly carpenters and labourers on the early Jindabyne Dam site in about 1950. And what I take from that picture is the spirit of optimism and goodwill um, among the workers. And it's hard to convey that this was really what distinguished the Snowy from so many other projects, certainly today, this feeling of mission that they had. I was very skeptical about it when I started interviewing people. I mean, I just interviewed people and I gradually started to realize, oh my gosh, they're really proud of what they've done. And to a fault, I mean, it was just true of every single worker, even the people who'd had accidents or whatever on the Snowy. They were really proud of this, of being part of what they felt was an important nation building project. So I think that's something to think about. Why was that spirit there? Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So yeah, just whip through the little the points that I've got. They're all you just have to keep hitting return and they'll come up. So that was Nelson Lemon and Ben Chifley. Um, Lemon was a really interesting character because I spoke to him just 6 months before he died, and I feel like the Grim Reaper doing oral history sometimes because people are really disposed to distill what they've contributed. They really value the ability to pass on something for posterity. And by just chance, I happened on him at this time, vulnerable time in his life, and he was still feisty. Could you just go through the little pointers, Heather? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, just
gotcha.
whip through them all. Yeah. So I won't go into the devious means. It's all in chapter one. It's a lesson in just backdoor politicking. He Nelson Lemon had a vision for the Snowy scheme, and he wasn't going to be gainsaid by the shenanigans of normal cabinet politics or opposition politics, which aren't actually that different than what we're seeing today. Um, he was actually from a farming background in WA, so he was more interested in the irrigation aspects. But at the time, there were blackouts in the capital cities on the East Coast, and that was a political no-no for people like Chifley. Obviously, people were disgruntled, annoyed, and so it was a big win to emphasize the electrical side. I know you're interested in electricity, but they had at least equal pulling power, and electricity was still a fairly unknown quantity. There was a song popular at the time, "Put a Light in Every Country Window" by Don Henderson, which was like celebrating electricity like some kind of miraculous thing that had arrived. But it was very new. Now I'm going to play the audio. This is just of Bill Hudson addressing the nation. No, yeah, addressing the nation three
How do I
months or so.
play that, Siobhan?
You just go in there and there's a little arrow. Just press on that and there's a little arrow in there that'll come up.
No, when I press like that,
It
am I
should.
meant to have downloaded this?
Well, it's part of the PowerPoint. If you've got the PowerPoint, you didn't just download it as a PDF. No.
No, I'm playing it off the let me
Well, hang on.
download it.
I can do it from here. I can do if I'm
Ah, great. Yes,
I'll,
okay.
I'll do the audio. So let me just do it here. So here's Bill Hudson talking to the nation, and it just captures, if it plays, it captures the sense of um, just old-fashioned patriotism and humility. And then there's a song at the end which sounds quaint to our ears now, but I'll talk about that.
The Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority was born on August the 1st of this year, when I was appointed as its first employee. The small labour force we are now collecting will grow to 9,000 at least, perhaps more. Ahead of us lie many years of toil, numerous obstacles to be surmounted, and I have no doubt many disappointments. But these are what make the achievement of an objective worthwhile.
Keep listening.
The nation has accepted the scheme, and if I judge Australians rightly, they will see that it goes through. His white car and put down his pen, with slow down mountain, build you a dam, bigger and better than all man can
So I included that because, it captures the sense of both machismo and patriotism and daring do and adventurousness that was all part of that beginning. And also the huge competitiveness with the US, who were the undoubted world leaders at the time in any of these kind of big construction projects. Next slide, please, Heather. So yeah, the early workforce came largely from the Eastern European countries. There were 170,000, just pull through the bullet points. There were 170,000 displaced persons that Chifley brought in the early years. And he was one of the first in the world to respond to the UN call to rehouse what were then about 3 million displaced persons, which was huge, not big in today's terms, but huge then. And the reason was really because of this personal approach by Robert Jackson, who happened to be an Australian and also Secretary of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And this was important because the displaced persons and the later migrants, the economic migrants who'd come from Italy and other places, they had this they had nothing to lose and a huge amount to gain. And that informed their whole approach to the project. They were willing to live in conditions that ordinary Australians didn't want to or wouldn't consider living under. Just simple privations like living in a tent, eating maggoty food, really basic sort of stuff. Because for them it was salvation from the war and it was a chance to start again. And that was through everybody I interviewed who'd come in the first 10 years of the Snowy scheme. That was the chance to start again in a new world, fresh, miles away, as far away as you could get from the theatre of war that they'd come from. So let's see. Yeah, I just have the tape of Sir Robert Jackson I'll play because this is a great little piece where he's describing something that was like huge for Australia. He's describing how he convinced Chifley to take those early migrants, and they were afraid, first of all, that they'd be swamped with Poles, and that this had apparently happened in Buffalo City in the US. They'd got too many Poles, and he said, "I don't want too many Poles." But anyway, just the little cameo of Chifley that he brings up. I can't see the audio in this slide to play it. Where is it? I can't see it. It mustn't be
You
here.
click through up the top, perhaps, so I get a little thing up the top there.
At the very top. Oh yeah, I can see it. Yeah, okay, I'll play this. This is a bit muddy, but there it is.
Well, I went with General Kennan and saw Mr. Chifley. He certainly was a most remarkable man. I never get his pipe to light. All the matches go over his shoulder all the time. Oh, how many do you want us to take? And I said, well, sir, can you take 100,000? Why should we take 100,000? I said, the logic there is whoever gets the first 100,000 is going to get the absolute cream of the crop or whatever you like. He thought that was good logic. Then he said, oh, well, not too many Poles. We don't want a Buffalo City in Australia. So I said, no, you needn't take too many Poles. There are plenty of Bolsonaro as well. Anyway, he said, we'll do it. Then he added the boys, presumably that was the cabinet, wouldn't like it, but I'll convince Arthur, I think it was Mr. Cornwall, it will be done.
So I'm always tickled by that as just such an incredibly significant moment in migration policy and yet done in such a kind of seemingly happenstance way. So next slide is about the migrant workers. because there were 30, next slide, yeah, 30 plus nationalities on the scheme. And among the most important were the Norwegians, who were brought in specifically to build Gothica. That was put out to tender as a power station, as a dam, and various people responded, but Selmer Engineering, the man who ran Selmer, was 71 when he won the contract. It took about 3 or 4 or 5 days to get in from Norway to Australia at that time, and there's some funny stories about him in the book. He was a very unflappable man, and the Norwegians were really well liked. It was stipulated they bring 90% of the workforce, because at that stage the Snowy Mountains Authority fledgling didn't have enough labour because they were competing with other post-war reconstruction things in Australia. So the Norwegians came in, 90% of the workforce, but immediately went on strike, wanting conditions like hot showers, double glazing, things that were unheard of to the men battling it out on the Snowy as ordinary workers. They had big fancy lunches with white tablecloths at the edge of the tunnel. They were just extraordinary. But the good thing about them was that they insisted that the other 10% of the workforce also got their conditions. They once went on strike when margarine was served in the mess rather than butter, and they had to bring in butter from Sydney. So they were really an interesting group. They knew their stuff. It came in on budget, and Menzies opened Gothica in 55, and by which stage it was a huge political coup and starting to build public relations benefit. After that, from the 50s, we had Italians. We always had Germans, but they were a mixture of selected tradesmen who were hand-picked in a kind of a recruitment drive, and very highly skilled Germans who were brilliant at survey technology, including digital technological methods that were unheard of in the world at the time. And some of these Germans were facilitated to come to Australia, and people looked the other way if they had SS records. Just a few. I think it was 14 that were later disclosed in official secrets revelations. One of them was a man I interviewed who was the chief surveyor, who had been a member of the SS. But Australia wanted the expertise, so did America, so did Britain, and so it was just a free for all to get these people, regardless of any dodgy political past which they might have had. Australians were a minority, and they tended to stay above ground. And yeah, there were all kinds of tensions early on. I'll just play a small bit about that. There's a nice little kind of vox pop I did here with a bunch of workers. It starts with a woman who was her name is Ksenia Nijelski, and she was from she spoke 6 languages, and she had to work as a domestic worker when she came to Australia from the Baltic countries, because they were given no choice, regardless of whether they were engineers, lawyers, doctors, surgeons, however accomplished they were just labour to the Snowy Mountains Authority, and nobody complained about that. They just accepted it, did their 2 years on the Snowy or in whatever government authority they had to work in, and then they went on to build careers as she did. But here's a little vox pop.
There were quite a few tensions because it was not long after the Second World War finished, but somehow it didn't last. It may have been an argument, maybe even a fight, but people realized that it's not worthwhile carrying on those old troubles into a new country.
The German would call the Italian amigo, the Italian would call German Kameraden, whatever.
I'd never ever seen a fight between any nationalities. Often you'd have a few fellas that fall out in the wet canteen and have a bit of a punch up, very few and far between.
But I would say that probably the hardest person to get on with out in those early construction camps would have been the old Australians who were prepared to change. The country had been his. He'd worked at his own pace. He resented people coming in and making more money than he was making, although the same opportunities were there. So everybody got a fair go. Everybody was treated the same.
So interesting. That was Frank Rodwell, who was a security officer, Australian, obviously. And just one quick other clip. Tom Little was a ganger and he worked with this German guy, Otto Blank. I really liked Otto, kind of because of his strange surname, which even more strangely, out of all the migrants I interviewed, the Maritime Museum in Sydney chose a quote from Otto Blank to go on their migration wall. If you step off the ferry in Pyrmont Bay now, you see the migration wall, and he has a whole column to himself, and they have a quote from Otto, who was it was a lovely man, but kind of a sad man who lived a lonely life. But he was a boxer, and yeah, he was a good bloke, but he copped a lot of the anti-German feeling that understandably was around at the beginning. But here's Tom Little just kind of sticking up for him, and I think it's quite interesting what he says.
I had 4 years in the army. That was all forgot. I could have hated those German chaps as much as anybody else, but I couldn't see any sense in it. They were there to do a job. He was a man. The war was over, and they were there to kick off again and start life anew.
Okay, so I've only got, I think, 2 more slides I'll play. Yeah. So could we go to the next one? Thanks, Heather. Investigation work. Yeah. So that was really interesting because, of course, the Snowy was pretty pristine. I mean, obviously, the indigenous peoples of the area had been there for millennia before. And there's a tradition in particular of congregating around the confluence of the Bogong Moth in the high country. But to be honest, and I mean, I have to, this is one of the big differences. I don't have many, if any, references to Indigenous history in my book because it was not there. It was not visible. It was not mentioned. It was it was not available when I was researching this in the mid 1980s. I didn't find any records of Aboriginal people working on the scheme. I did find one Maori worker from New Zealand. And nobody mentioned it because I think that is one of the huge shifts now that has happened culturally in terms of, we talked about it as virgin territory, and you wouldn't do that now because you talk about First Nations people. But in terms of practical access, there was almost none. There were a couple of ski lodges. There were no roads. The Snowy scheme, they started building tracks by hand with axes at the beginning, and then later they got the first Land Rovers in Australia in December 1949. Before that, it was just literally men walking in, bush beating, bushwhacking, and they were told to only cut the minimal track. And that wasn't so much out of environmental awareness as out of pragmatic economic concerns. Don't make something 2 meters when 1 meter will do, or half a meter. We just need to get to this site to check, is it a geologically viable site for a dam, etc. Pack horsemen were the early people who supported these investigation workers, who were first the diamond drillers, getting cores for the geology people to inspect, then the hydrographers who often had to ski in, which is why they needed people like the Czechs and people from cold European countries. There were some local skiers, but not many. Skiing was very much an elite sport in Australia at the time, although it had been around since Kiandra in the 1860s as a functional thing in the gold days. And then the surveyors. And I mean, the terrain was so steep. I remember that same Wally Wasserman telling me that once it took him 20 minutes to get from one side of his theodolite to another because of the gradient. It was just incredible territory. Kon Martinoff, this lovely man, who is a white Russian, as they were described then, escaping communism, he told me that he actually spent 7 years, the first 7 years in the Snowy, living in a tent. And he was a chain man, an assistant surveyor. But he told me you needed one long leg and one short leg to get around in that territory. So here's a little bit of Con. He's a lovely, quiet fellow, and he reflects on, I think, the damage. Many of these men were damaged by war, and they were seeking healing in nature, and that's why they were happy to put up with the privations of the bush. Here he is.
People wanted to think, to form or carve out a life for themselves in this new country, to have a go. And from Bill Hudson, the commissioner, right there on, it was a feeling that we are doing something worthwhile.
Yeah, and Con was so proud of his role on the Snowy and his contribution. It was very just therapeutic and validating for a lot of people. It wasn't a jingoistic pride that they took. It was much more a sense of doing something right after the destruction of war, which made the Snowy such a special crucible, not just for multiculturalism, but for a kind of a new beginning of modern Australia. So the last slide will be about the construction course, which was, oh no, I think I've got two, construction and tunnels. So the construction was remarkably efficient, given that they were by within 10 years, the Snowy engineering know-how had outgrown the American Bureau of Reclamation, who had started out virtually as their kind of mentors and sponsors. And Australia was developing its own expertise, and they would go on to develop things like rock bolts, which I'm sure you're aware of, which was a terrific advance in engineering, allowing people to hold up tunnels with using lateral forces rather than having to concrete line every inch of the space. And they're still used today. I often see them as I drive past places, and I kind of think of Thomas Lang, who was credited with, coming up with that. That was a massive contribution to the world, and the Snowy was recognized as an engineering wonder of the world. But there were lots of negative aspects. Basically, as you'll know from my book, they brought in contractors. The Snowy Manus Authority was a government instrumentality, but they tendered the big works out to the commercial contractors, and most of that in the early stages was picked up by American firms linked to the Kaiser Group, who had built the Liberty ships in World War II. Later, Australian Thiess, would start to get a lot of these contracts, and again, they developed their own expertise and would go on to build a quarter of the scheme. But the Americans, while they were superbly efficient with things like designing specific machinery to operate at 3 levels to drill tunnels most efficiently, that's in the next slide, they were also ruthless employers, and they just fired somebody on the spot if they were found just dozing off, for instance, on a graveyard shift. However, they were clever at keeping workers happy. They gave them good food. They paid a bonus system which encouraged workers to race against the clock in order to get up to 6 times what the average Australian labourer was getting off the Snowy scheme at the time. So the financial incentive was massive for people who were trying to bring refugee family over from Europe to live with them, and sadly contributed to the deaths, which I'll deal with in the next slide. So yeah, there was a mantra, a man a mile will be lost in tunnelling. And actually, the Snowy did relatively well. It's a grisly statistic, but St. Bernard Pass in Switzerland at the time, they had 3.0 men a mile lost. Mont Blanc, they had 1.4. The Snowy, 0.6. So actually, in overall terms, horrible as it is, 121 men died on the scheme, over 50 of them underground, but it was actually not as bad. And they did do good safety things, such as instigating seatbelts way ahead of other instrumentalities. So maybe the next slide, please. Last one, the tunnels. So yeah, the tunnels, to me, were always the mystical heart of the scheme. A lot of it was built underground. That was partly for faux security reasons. The way they got it through Parliament was by pretending that the power stations would be blown out of the water, and that enabled them to it fed into post-war paranoia and enabled them to put it under the Defence Act, which enabled Chifley to keep the states out of the argument and make it a federal project, which was a kind of a fairly cowboyish approach, but it worked in many ways. It did lead to constitutional challenges, but that was all resolved in 59, 10 years in. So with the tunnelling, They just developed. That's the jumbo there in the picture, the three-story, three-floor thing that enabled, compared to the Norwegians who had their pelican picks and were just going at it. This was like, going from a bicycle to a Rolls Royce. It was extraordinary, and they broke world records. They increased the rate of hard rock drilling by up to 6 times. They played on the machismo and the ethnic rivalries of the men, as well as the financial incentive to get them going against each other. And I'll just play you two last pieces of audio. I can stay on a little bit longer. I know you're here till 8:30. So let's just. There were two awful accidents which I can talk about later if you want, but it's all in the book. I was the first person to be able to get access to the inquest, which I had to fight very hard to get for 6 months because the New South Wales Department of Justice was trying to not allow access on the grounds of so-called privacy. Anyway, can talk about that. But here is, let's see, I've got two little clips here. One is two workers. The first, talking about the dangerous conditions of tunnelling. The first is Ulick O'Boyle, who is a remarkable Irishman. I'm Irish, obviously, and in one sense, I could see where Ulick was coming from. He's a classic kind of Irish character, very like a brilliant sense of social justice, but also a difficult, contrary kind of person who would take on anyone in a fight and was really stroppy. But he was also very bright and had trained in first aid and indeed was going to be a doctor before he came to the Snowy. So he had a very intelligent overview of what was going on. He could appraise and analyze. He relished the diversity of the place. He also wrote 50 songs about it for a group called the Settlers, which really are a fabulous record in their own right of the Snowy. And yeah, so he starts telling us about what happened and why people died in certain instances because of unsafe practices, because of the rush. And then Pino Freizza, another great character, an Italian who came here with his only skills, he told the immigration people, were that he was good at soccer. And he ended up buying a house in 6 months down the Snowy in Paddington, which I've just, it was actually a slum at the time, but still, and sending money home to his mother. So here they are.
When they finish the drilling, when they blast, they've got a new rock face then to drill again. So there might be sort of 12 drill holes or 20 drill holes, but there'd be a little bit left of the old drilling holes in the rock. So to get a quick start, what the miners used to often do was put their drills into the old, what they called buttholes. This could be very dangerous because sometimes, incredibly almost, after they'd fired the rock, some of the gelignite would stay in the butthole and not have gone off. You might get half a stick of gelignite in there. So then when you put in the drill, bang, bang, she'll go off.
The danger was there, but believe you me, they was looking for the big fat wedges. When you're young, you don't know. And believe you me, the Americans make sure that you work. Very, very tough people. Come on, Joe.
So yeah, those sound effects sound a little bit hokey there, but they were actual archival sound effects from the film unit that the Snowy Mountains Authority deployed to very carefully and cleverly record all their work, basically for PR purposes. They'd make newsreels that would play in cinemas ahead of the main feature. This was a time when there wasn't any television even in the early days. And the last clip I'll play you is from the head of the Australian Workers Union, Charlie Oliver, who, when I interviewed him, he was like in his 80s, but he seemed to me to be still very compass. And the Australian Workers Union had like 6,500 out of the 7,500 workforce that applied at the maximum construction time of about 1959. So they were massive. And I was very unimpressed with Charlie Oliver. He had done very good things in other situations, in other industries. He was actually ahead of his time in defending the rights of Aboriginal farm labourers in the cotton industry who were being sprayed with pesticides, and he was calling for changes in that area, which was remarkably prescient. But on the Snowy, he just seemed baffled by the multicultural workforce. He couldn't understand it, and he was on a bit of a power trip, in my view. And so the safety inspections by the AW were just not up to standard. They weren't doing their job. They were just happy to get everybody signed up and have the money and have the power that they held. So here he is describing what he thought of as the kind of workers' attitude on the Snowy.
They couldn't relate it to what you'd call a normal mining operation. Compared to coal miners who are like mercenary troops, just there for what they could get. Weren't motivated by any sense of loyalty to the industry or anything like that. In an ordinary mine, the conditions would be entirely different. There's none of that racing around like you were in them tunnels. They were football teams, racing in, and these massive jumbos with all these people handling away.
Okay, so I think that's me. That's the presentation done, and I hope the voices. I really I love hearing those voices, and there's something about the power of audio and the voice that really makes people live and shine through. So I hope that's illuminated some of the aspects that you might not have considered before. Yeah.
One, thank you so much. It's just really great. And you make it so personal with the way you describe these people. So it's been absolutely fabulous. I know you have to leave, but can everyone who wants to ask a question, I think this is a small window that we've got Siobhan for if you have a question that you'd like to extend our discussion with. Oh, and a thank you from Catherine, who hasn't actually talked to us but's been listening the whole time. Siobhan, can I ask you to reflect on what you see of the energy transition today, and we do need to do massive, big changes today, but it's so politicized and divisive and stuff like that. And I just wonder what we can draw on from. I love the idea of pride, right? Like, how can we all be more proud of what we're all trying to build?
Well, I was thinking about that because obviously the Snowy happened at a very specific and unique moment in Australia's evolution. And, it happened in the context of the Cold War and post-World War II rebuilding and that sense of we must never let this happen again, and therefore we must all pull together, which I suppose you would imagine that climate action should be an equally galvanizing and universal force, but it seems to be so splintered by the kind of self-regarding different commercial and political interests that it's really hard to detect that same sort of almost altruistic sense of caring about future generations and the nation. And I mean, I don't want to make us all go through a war in order to feel grateful to be alive, but that was the kind of abiding spirit of the people that I interviewed, that they knew they'd been given a second. It'd be like taking people from Palestine or somewhere and just transplanting them and saying, you've come out of the rubble and here you are, you'll have to work really hard, but you're doing something that will enable your children to have a future and contribute to something to the world. And it was like that on a large scale. And that's the only reason I think that people were able to set aside those wartime animosities. I mean, so, do we have to go through something ghastly in order to get people to sort of bring people to almost breaking point and then get them to reorganize their priorities? We none of us want that. but it just seems really hard to shake people out of their comfortable lives and make them understand that the stakes are, if not as high, but pretty well as high when you're starting to talk about climate action and what needs to be done. I mean, I have thought about it, Heather, but I'm afraid, I did warn you. I stop at 1974. I don't have any answers after that. Snowy 2.0. Um, at last year I heard a presentation on it, and to be honest, meeting some people who worked on it was the most positive thing I've ever heard about it, which may be, you know, kind of obvious, but I did feel, I felt I came away from that presentation feeling less negative about it in the sense that there were certainly points of comparison with the workforce being very diverse and multicultural on the Snowy 2.0 and coming in and they were setting up English classes for people in Kuma. And I thought, oh my God, this is just like the 50s all over again, except that the people were coming from Asia or from other places. But the dislocation and the displacement and the cultural clash and the gratitude that people felt when people reached out to them in the community in Kuma or whatever was very similar. So I wouldn't lose hope. I really amn't qualified to speak about the engineering aspects. Just one thing that one of the engineers I spoke to, I said, well, what's this crazy stuff with, the tunnel boring machine flow being stranded for X amount of time? And, why couldn't you have foreseen this? And he actually said something that I felt was really quite true. He said, this is the nature of geological exploration. We cannot tell what the rock will be like until we go in. And the nature of our engineering project is that we have to troubleshoot whatever conditions arise, and that's our challenge. And this one was a particularly difficult thing, but I felt that was kind of honest, and that did resonate with me a little in the way that people responded on Snowy 1.0. That's all I can say really about that.
Well,
Maybe.
sure, as we race to the future, Peter, that'd be your every day, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's true. I think in hindsight, probably these engineering challenges could be avoided, but we often deal with them.
Not in foresight. Can I ask what the state challenge was about? Like, I can't imagine why the states would try to take something that's being funded by the feds off them or anything like that. But why did the states?
They wanted irrigation rights and they wanted a share in all of that. And this way, the feds kept control of everything. State water and resumption of land were state rights, actually. And so this was highly irregular, that they would ride roughshod over them and trample that. And the only way they could do it was through this manufactured emergency thing that Nelson Lemon came up with because, he was just that hard scrabble farmer who wasn't going to let these fellas in suits down in Canberra or anywhere, get run around him. And he was just a cocky, as he described himself to me. And he was not cunning, but he had that kind of clever, streetwise kind of ability. And I mean, I love that story in the first chapter of my book where he says to Chifley, we'll put it all under the Defence Act, and that way states can't have a bar of it. And he says, your name's Nelson Lemon, you're not Ned Kelly. And they kind of laugh. And then Chifley says, okay, but if there's a constitutional challenge, you'll have to get Evatt to defend it. And Evatt was the great constitutional lawyer who was part of the founding of the United Nations in 1948. And so, very cleverly, Lemon knew that his great rival, Evatt's great rival, was Jack Deadman, another minister in post-war reconstruction. And so he made up this thing completely. He goes to see Evatt and he says, this is what we're planning to do. Of course, Jack Deadman says it can't be done under the Constitution. And Evatt immediately took the bait and said, what would he know about constitutional law? I'll defend it. And so he signed up for that. And it was just complete personality, psychology, politics, and whatever. And then he took it one further. When they got to cabinet, Deadman objected to the fact that they were going to appoint Hudson without having put it out to three people. And he said, rules of cabinet, you need three names. And Sir Lemon took back the piece of paper and wrote Hudson, 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 and gave it back to Chifley. And that's how they appointed Bill Hudson. I mean, look, Bill Hudson's application for the biggest project in Australian history arrived on the back of an envelope handed over to somebody because while this bloke was on a sickie at the cricket. You couldn't write this stuff. It was just amazing. But I see, these things still happen. These people still have these kind of corridor conversations, and so I think that's a lesson that we can take, that, it comes down to how you play. I mean, you mentioned Saul Griffith is charismatic. That's a lot of his success, that he knows how to talk to a crowd and he knows how to schmooze the politicians and he has the tech expertise. It's not enough to have just one of those things. You need to have the full kit to get something happening.
Work on my schmooze. I can do the tech.
Yeah.
Question on you touched on the American connection, so it was interesting. I think I read the Lyndon Johnson's biography where he sort of came to prominence under Roosevelt, and there's whole chapters in that book about the hydro schemes in the US. So I'm interested if you looked at any of that, and so that was a depression, so it wasn't a post-war thing; it was a depression thing. So I'm so curious about whether you sort of looked at any of those
Well,
contrasts or how those companies
the
came together.
Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley,
Yeah.
they were the big projects prior to the Snowy. And, there was a formal arrangement for the first 10 years of the Snowy where it was like, a group of Snowy engineers, maybe the 10 to 20 people, would go on what was effectively like a year's internship with the US Bureau of Reclamation and be kind of, taught how to deal with these big construction projects on the ground. And so that was, I mean, that was obviously something. I don't really, I didn't find anything in the archives that kind of illuminated the political background to that. I think it was just that post the curtain reaching out to, America after the fall of Singapore, we were allies. And of course, they were starting to develop important political ties with us that would lead to things like Pine Gap. So I suppose that was just part of the to and froing, that they were getting a bit of kudos or brownie points by inviting the Australian engineers over and sharing. And then, as I said, it reversed from about 1961 onwards when the Australians had more to teach the Americans from what they'd learned on the ground with the Snowy, which was just unbelievable given that, at the outset, Australia was such a tiny country and it was just a blip and it was just really an outpost of Britain in most people's eyes at the time. So, yeah, I don't have, I mean, I've visited the Hoover Dam when I was in the States, and it was interesting to me to see, the same stories of people dying in accidents that could have been avoided. And it was very sad. I mean, I know that people die in big construction projects. You can't avoid it in a way, but I wrote in my book that safety was sacrificed to speed, and nobody has sued me yet, because I saw it in the inquests. I saw it acknowledged, that they were able to push things that shouldn't have happened, and they flouted rules at times, and they didn't do a head count in one case when two men had jumped down from the little locomotive and hadn't got back to the safety of the firing switch, and they were just exposed in the tunnel, and the guy still pressed the firing switch to detonate it because of this mad push to win a world record. And one bloke was decapitated and the other died a few days later or a few weeks later in hospital. One had been 2 days on the Snowy workforce. They were young men. They shouldn't have died. They shouldn't have died. And they did, because of the lack of enforcement of rules. So, that stuff used to get me really exercised. I felt really sad about that. And of course, horrific injuries, and not just the people who died, but there were people who suicided because of their horrific injuries. Even the few who got compensation would, were sometimes just not able to keep going. So yeah, I think Australia just outgrew the US, even though they were still dealing with them at the contractor level. And Tees borrowed from the US playbook. I mean, they learned how to do it. And then it became, replicated the work practices, the clever stuff of giving them all a good feed in the wet canteen and the PR thing, free beer when they got a world record, all this sort of stuff really helped. I mean, we didn't really have workplace psychology in those days. It was all in its infancy, but they were playing a version of that. This is all part of it. This is why the snowy is still studied by people in all kinds of different fields. But yeah, how it goes down there or how it would go, how you go about making people get excited about electricity today or renewables, because maybe because they're not, so many of them are private enterprise, there isn't that same attachment. I don't know. I'm just groping in the dark here.
Ask one last question about the people whose towns and lives got flooded, because in the wind stuff, people have coined a couple of terms. So one of them is a bit like nostalgia, but it's about losing my home because you've just put a wind farm in the middle of it, sort of thing. And this happens with mining as well. And another one is about not being able to imagine the future with me in it. So losing my ability to imagine my home as all this stuff changes around me. And I just wondered what sort of, I heard you in the Richard Feidler interview and thought, how did these people reflect that deep, deep loss of their home and the displacement?
Well, they were some of the saddest stories that I recorded, particularly the people from Adaminaby, because that was the first test site to be drowned in 1956 to 59 is when the inundation started. And there was no sort of template for them. So they made poor choices, um, such as relocating to a site that wasn't near the eventually newly created artificial reservoir, which meant that they were off the tourist map and it didn't do well for them commercially. But also they opted to have their old homes transported and re-erected, and a lot of them were dodgy and not never worked properly. Um, there was a huge sentimental loss and emotional sense that yeah, they'd lost all their memories, and for many it was many generations. They'd been there since the 1830s, some of them. Um, and really, you can feel it in the air. Like today, it's never taken off. It's to me, you've got your big trout there, but it doesn't have the vibrancy that Jindabyne has, because Jindabyne learned from that, and they went a different route, and they reinvented themselves in a very sustainable and viable way as a tourist destination with the lake and the gateway to the skiing and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that was the only negative comment I ever heard about Bill Hudson was from a disgruntled former resident of Adaminaby who was angry and resentful about getting less than she wanted for her property, which is understandable. But like at the same time, nobody could recompense you for the emotional loss. I mean, you can have a valuation, but doesn't adequately make up. Um, so yeah, Jindabyne Adaminaby Talbingo, um, really, really wrenching stuff to see your home literally just drowned. And those stories that I have in the book about the woman going back and seeing the peach tree in bloom for the first time as it was about to go under, are just heartbreaking. But at the same time, there was really never a sense of resistance. There was never a sense, which is unlike today, where you do have the people dividing, polarizing communities around wind farms. Should we have them? Should we not? And I mean, what to me is the worrying thing is the insidious role of people like Advance Australia and other lobby groups in these communities, who it's not just genuine community feeling, which you could understand that there would be a range of feeling. It's orchestrated and manipulated by outside influences who have ulterior motives. And that is definitely the biggest change, I would say. Obviously, back in those days, they didn't even have television until the mid 50s. They didn't have social media. They didn't have the internet. They were reliant. Yes, there was the power of the press, but there was a belief in big government, and it wasn't a dirty word. And so they were willing to make sacrifice. You know, the phrase that I used to hear, it had to be done for the greater good. And I love that phrase. And I actually used it in a letter I wrote to protest against the Snowy Hydro when it was being mooted by John Howard's government to be sold off and privatised. And I wrote a passionate letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, which stirred up a bit of a kerfuffle. And in the end, he backed down. I mean, I'm not saying it was because of my letter. There were a lot of obvious voices about that. But it was the first time I'd ever seen Howard back down on anything. And it was because people responded. I said these people died. 121 young men gave their lives for the greater good. They didn't do it. You know, they had a mission. And are we just to hand that over to the highest bidder and all the rest of it? And I mean, I think we just have to get into somehow making people understand that this is important. The greater good for generations to come matters to everybody, and expose the pernicious influence of these lobby groups. I've seen it down here in the Illawarra. We had a proposed wind farm, and it is disgusting, um, and scary how good they are at infiltrating a community. I live right on the ocean. I could show you the ocean off my deck right now. We are one of the people with views. We don't care if the view is impeded by wind farm turbines. We know that the greater good will be served by having wind energy. So, I'm a person who put in a submission just as an ordinary resident saying, yes, go ahead, please do it. But I'm shocked in the people I'm meeting just in the community, people who believe the propaganda against wind farms. So I do not know. It's horrible. I don't know. This is where I hand over the baton to you lot to try and fight the good fight.
Alex, you've come off mute. Is there something you were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, hi, Siobhan, and apologies for coming in late. I was curious about, I've read a little bit about your lawn, which had a similar thing where the town was destroyed and ripped up. And to me, there's an interesting idea of like this loss of mourning where the whole town is obliterated. Like the same as if it's flooded a valley, you have nothing to mourn, which is perhaps a different sentiment to say a wind farm is built around your house, as you said, Heather, that loss of what may have been. And your lawn still has community groups who meet annually to kind of remember the town. Is there any of that with the Snowy, or was your lawn quite a special case?
Yeah, no, there are like there when it's a very when the water recedes, there are trips. People go back there to kind of see the remnant bits of ironbark or whatever is left of old residences. And there's a Facebook group, Kids of the Snowy Mountain Scheme, that's very active, doing things like that. Um, I mean, obviously, those people are now in their 60s, 70s, and whether their kids will keep it going. But I've been to some of those. I went to one of the Kids of the Snowy Mountains groups at one of the reunions in Cooma about 5, 6 years ago. So there's a huge amount of nostalgia, both from local people and from the people who came in to build the Snowy and grew up in these areas and have much less long-standing ties to the land, but still have strong attachments, sentimental and emotional attachments to place. So yeah, I think that it should be possible to let community continue or promulgate their sense of connection with or without whatever adaptations are made for renewable energy. Maybe that's one way of appeasing people and making them realize it doesn't have to be either or, you know? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, but I really, I mean, Advance Australia has now got 500,000 signed up members. And because I'm a media journalism academic, you know, I keep an eye on these things. And just as a means of manipulating public opinion, it's you know, and there are very good articles. There's a guy at UTS who's written an article that actually sets out this whole thing right back to the 50s to 1950s fossil fuel links. I forget his name. He's a UTS academic.
Jeremy Walker?
Jeremy Walker. That's him. Yeah, Jeremy Walker. That article is chilling. And, you know, I posted it on my social media and I didn't get a lot of traction. I don't understand why. He got the usual people interviewing him on ABC Radio National, and that was about it, as far as I could tell. But it's very obvious. It goes right back to the coal companies, and it goes right back to people like Morris Newman in Australia, and people, and then Murdoch, and all the rest of it. And you know, I don't have access to grind. You know, I'm a retired academic at the moment, but it just shocks me how little the general public are aware of it, and that if you start to talk about it, if I start to talk about it at a coffee morning after some social thing, I can see people kind of thinking, oh, she's off on some crazy rant, you know, like it sounds like you're a crazy person. You become the person who sounds like you're a conspiracy theorist when actually you're trying to expose what is happening. So it's a very, very, very difficult one. And I'm just so glad that some of you guys seem to be really working to try and change things.
Starts with open conversations, doesn't it? You know. I would like to thank you ever so much. I'm going to close us off here tonight, everyone. I'm away for 2 months, so Merry Christmas to you all. Get your reading going. We've got two big books already lined up for next year.
Oh, can I just say, plug, if any of you have children who are aged around 9 to 12, can you see that? I did do a children's version of The Snowy called simply Snowy by Scholastic. And it's a fictional account of growing up on the Snowy Mountain scheme through the eyes of an 11-year-old girl called Eva Fisher, you know, but it's all based on the real people I interviewed, and some of the miscreant stuff is based on my then two young sons and the stuff they'd get up to, and any of the bad stuff comes from them. But actually, look, the feedback from kids, it's got a horrible cover, terrible cover. So no kid in their right mind would pick it up voluntarily. But when teachers make them read it, the feedback is brilliant because they love it. And so it's a kind of an adventure story with girls outwitting the American contractors and stopping the inundation of a favorite sentimental piece that one of the girls' parents had, and enlisting two rapscallion Italians to help them with all this. It's a real piece of, you know, just adventure set in the 50s and 60s, but it sneakily kind of introduces all the elements of multiculturalism and all the social history of the Snowy. So yeah, just mentioning it because I always forget to mention it and people don't realize it's out there.
I'm going to plug that in our next email, so I'll definitely make sure more people know about it. And Nick is growing readers. They'll be readers in about 10 years' time. They'll be ready for that book.
Well, one of them's a keen reader, but not quite young adult yet. Particularly young adult, perhaps. But
Yeah,
thank you again, everybody.
thank you so much, Siobhan. That was fantastic.
You're very welcome, and good luck with all your endeavors. And if you want me to put in any word with Saul Griffith, I'll see him on the beach one of these days, no doubt, and happy
Definitely. Tell him he's missing out, that he's not part of the Energy Nerds book club.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Maybe, yeah. Would you think about maybe? Anyway, I'll mention it to him. Yeah, sure.
Definitely.
Okay, all the best. Thanks for
Okay.
having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Welcome.